It was an ordinary summer evening in the quiet, leafy streets of Albany, Georgia, when 20-year-old Isaiah Parker suddenly vanished without a trace. The entire community was left reeling as news spread that Isaiah, a popular and well-liked young man, had not come home after what seemed like a routine night out. His girlfriend, Danielle Carter, was the first to notice something was wrong. She had expected him to return after a late-night movie, but by midnight his phone was off, and there was no word from him. As the hours ticked by, panic settled in. Isaiah was not the type to simply disappear. Danielle, a sharp and independent 19-year-old, immediately called her mother, Patrice Carter, and her stepfather, Aaron Carter. They had always been close-knit, at least on the surface, and Isaiah had often spent time with the family, his presence a comforting and familiar one. But now, there was only silence. By the next morning, it became clear that Isaiah wasn't just running late. Something was terribly wrong. Danielle's distress escalated when the police were called, and an initial search turned up his car abandoned on a desolate stretch of road outside the city. The car was found unlocked, the keys still in the ignition, yet Isaiah was nowhere to be seen. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence pointing to where he could have gone, and no witnesses to explain what had happened that night. The local police launched a full investigation, but as they delved deeper, each clue only seemed to lead them further into a maze of questions. Behind Isaiah's disappearance lay more than just a missing person. It was the start of a deadly unraveling of secrets that had been festering in the shadows of a seemingly perfect suburban family. At the center of this storm was Danielle's mother, 43-year-old Patrice Carter. Patrice had long been regarded as a loving and devoted wife, living what most would describe as an idyllic life with her husband, Aaron, and their daughter. Aaron, a 50-year-old man with a solid career as a building contractor, had always worked long hours to provide for his family, often coming home late and exhausted. Their life seemed typical, calm and structured. But beneath the surface, Patrice had grown increasingly dissatisfied. Over the years, the passion in their marriage had faded, leaving her feeling trapped in a routine devoid of the excitement and intimacy she craved. The strain of her marriage only deepened when Danielle started dating Isaiah. He was everything Patrice wished she could find again, young, energetic, and full of life. Isaiah, a charming and handsome young man, had big plans for his future. He was already working part-time to save money for college, hoping to eventually start his own business. His charisma and confidence quickly won over everyone around him, including Aaron, who admired his ambition, and Danielle, who fell head over heels for him. But Patrice saw something different in Isaiah. What began as innocent admiration soon turned into something far more dangerous. She found herself longing for the attention and excitement that Isaiah represented. The more time he spent with her family, the more her feelings intensified, slowly transforming from a quiet infatuation to an overwhelming obsession. Isaiah, for his part, remained oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface. At first, he was flattered by the extra attention from Patrice, small gestures, compliments, and moments when they found themselves alone, chatting about anything and everything. But as time passed, the boundaries blurred. Patrice started finding excuses to be around him more often. She would show up at places she knew he would be, linger around their conversations, and create opportunities for them to be alone. What had begun as harmless flirtation spiraled out of control, and soon, Isaiah found himself entangled in an affair he hadn't meant to start. Isaiah's initial reluctance was quickly overcome by Patrice's persistence. She knew how to manipulate his emotions, playing on his fears and desires, convincing him that their relationship wasn't just a fling, it was something more, something special. The two began meeting in secret, always careful to avoid suspicion. They chose places outside of town, places where no one would recognize them, yet with each passing day, their secret became harder to keep. The once lively and affectionate relationship between Isaiah and Danielle started to crack under the pressure of his double life. Danielle, intuitive and sharp, noticed the subtle changes. Isaiah became more distant, avoiding conversations about their future and canceling plans at the last minute. The easygoing charm that had drawn her to him seemed to have faded, replaced by nervous energy and vague excuses. He was distracted, often checking his phone and offering short, non-committal answers when she asked him what was wrong. But Danielle wasn't the only one noticing the changes. Aaron, too, began to sense that something wasn't quite right. Patrice had been acting differently as well. She was more irritable, often leaving the house for reasons she refused to explain, and avoiding Aaron's attempts to connect with her. But Aaron, always focused on his work, chalked it up to stress and exhaustion. He trusted his wife and saw no reason to believe anything unusual was going on. Still, the tension in the household grew. Isaiah found it harder to juggle his relationship with Danielle and his affair with Patrice. His guilt weighed heavily on him, and he began to regret ever allowing things to go this far. He knew he had to end it, but every time he tried to break it off with Patrice, she found a way to pull him back in, convincing him that their relationship was worth the risk. One fateful evening, Isaiah made the decision to meet Patrice one last time. They arranged to meet at an old, abandoned cabin on the outskirts of town, one of their usual hideaways. He was determined to tell her that it was over, that he couldn't continue lying to Danielle. But things didn't go as planned. That was the last time anyone saw Isaiah alive. The next morning, when Isaiah didn't return, Danielle's world was thrown into chaos. His phone was still off, and she had no idea where he could be. As the hours passed, her concern grew into dread. When the police found his car, it became clear that something terrible had happened. Danielle, already anxious and scared, began to suspect that her mother knew more than she was letting on. Patrice's erratic behavior, her sudden mood swings, and her evasive answers when Danielle asked if she had seen Isaiah recently all seemed too strange to ignore. The once close bond between mother and daughter was now strained, with Danielle wondering if her mother was somehow involved in Isaiah's disappearance. As the police investigation began to unfold, the pieces of a dark and twisted puzzle started to emerge. What began as a simple missing persons case would soon reveal far more horrifying truths than anyone in the quiet suburb of Albany, Georgia, could have imagined. As the days passed with no word from Isaiah, Danielle found herself unable to sleep, consumed by the gnawing fear that something terrible had happened. The police were doing all they could, but it felt like every lead they followed hit a dead end. Danielle's gut told her there was something more going on, something her mother, Patrice, wasn't telling her. And that feeling of unease only deepened each time she saw the way Patrice avoided the subject of Isaiah altogether. Patrice Carter had always been the strong, composed figure in Danielle's life, but lately, she was a shadow of her former self. At 43, Patrice was still strikingly beautiful, with a presence that commanded attention. But over the past few months, her restlessness had become apparent to everyone around her, especially to Danielle. Her late-night disappearances, the strange glances she exchanged with Isaiah, and her short temper all pointed to something deeper, something darker. What Danielle didn't know was that Patrice had been hiding a secret that was tearing her apart from the inside. It had started innocently enough, a few compliments here and there, a lingering touch on the arm, a smile that lasted just a little too long. Isaiah, with his easy charm and youthful energy, had stirred something in Patrice that she hadn't felt in years. Her marriage to Aaron, though comfortable, had lost the fire it once had, and while Aaron was a good man, a reliable provider, he had grown distant, more absorbed in his work than in her. Loneliness had crept in, and Patrice began to feel invisible, trapped in the monotony of suburban life. Isaiah had changed that. He was young, full of ambition, and attentive in a way Aaron no longer was. At first, it was nothing more than a distraction, something to remind her she still had her own desires, her own needs. But as time went on, her feelings for Isaiah deepened, and she crossed a line she knew she should never have approached. The affair began with stolen moments. Patrice would find excuses to be alone with Isaiah, helping him with errands, offering advice on his future, or simply finding a way to bump into him when Danielle wasn't around. Isaiah, who had been dating Danielle for over a year, was initially flattered by the attention from Patrice. She was older, sophisticated, and she knew how to make him feel special in ways Danielle, with her youthful insecurities, couldn't. But Isaiah quickly found himself in over his head. What started as harmless flirting escalated into something far more dangerous. One afternoon, when Aaron was working late, and Danielle was out with friends, Patrice invited Isaiah over to the house. It was supposed to be a simple visit, nothing out of the ordinary, but as they sat alone in the living room, the tension between them became undeniable. "I feel like I can talk to you," Patrice said, her voice low and soft as she leaned in closer to Isaiah. "Like you understand me in a way no one else does." Isaiah shifted uncomfortably, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. "You know I care about you, Mrs. Carter," he said, trying to keep things light, but there was no mistaking the intensity in her eyes. Before he knew it, they had crossed a boundary that couldn't be undone. That night, Patrice and Isaiah began an affair that would haunt them both. They swore to keep it a secret. No one could ever know, especially Danielle. But as the weeks passed, it became harder and harder to maintain the facade. For Patrice, the affair was an escape, a way to feel alive again, to reclaim the passion she felt had slipped away from her life. But for Isaiah, it was a trap. He loved Danielle, but Patrice's manipulation had ensnared him, pulling him deeper into a situation he knew he couldn't control. He tried to end things with her, but each time, she would draw him back in with promises, with words of how much she needed him. "You're the only one who makes me feel this way," she whispered to him one night, her hands trembling as they met his. "Please don't leave me, Isaiah. I don't think I can handle it." Isaiah knew it was wrong, but he couldn't deny the power she had over him. And with each secret meeting, with each lie they told, the weight of their deception grew heavier. It wasn't just the betrayal of Danielle that gnawed at Isaiah. It was the growing fear that this could only end badly. He knew he couldn't continue like this, living a double life, but every time he tried to break free, Patrice found a way to reel him back in. And then something changed. Isaiah started to pull away more forcefully. He canceled their meetings, avoided her calls, and made excuses to not see her. Patrice noticed the shift, and it terrified her. She had become obsessed with him, and the thought of losing Isaiah, of him walking away and returning fully to Danielle, was more than she could bear. In her mind, Isaiah wasn't just a fleeting affair, he had become her last chance at happiness. Isaiah, on the other hand, was beginning to feel suffocated. He loved Danielle, and he hated himself for betraying her. But Patrice had a way of twisting his emotions, making him feel responsible for her happiness, even as he struggled to find a way out. Things came to a head one fateful evening. Isaiah had made up his mind. He was going to end things with Patrice for good. He couldn't live with the guilt anymore. He arranged to meet her at their usual secret spot, an old cabin just outside the city limits, where no one would see them. But when Isaiah arrived, he found Patrice waiting for him, her eyes wild with desperation. She had sensed what was coming, and she was not going to let him walk away easily. "You can't just leave me," she said, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. "I've given up everything for you, Isaiah. You can't just throw me away like this." Isaiah took a step back, his mind racing. "I'm sorry, Patrice," he said quietly, trying to keep his voice calm. "But this has to stop. I can't keep doing this. It's not right." But Patrice wouldn't hear it. "I need you," she insisted, stepping closer to him. "You said you loved me, Isaiah. Don't you remember? You said we were meant to be together." The desperation in her voice sent a chill down Isaiah's spine. He knew he had to get out of there, but something in Patrice's eyes told him she wasn't going to let him leave that easily. And then, as if on cue, everything went dark. The sun had barely risen over Albany when Danielle woke up to a feeling of deep unease. Isaiah was still missing, and the police investigation had reached a deadlock. Each day that passed without any news from him felt like an eternity. The silence was unbearable, and every ticking second only magnified her dread. The thought that her mother, Patrice, might know something about Isaiah's disappearance had taken root in her mind, growing stronger with each passing day. Patrice's behavior had become increasingly strange. She was distant, agitated, and constantly finding reasons to leave the house. Normally composed and attentive, she now avoided Danielle's questions with vague responses and an unsettling calm that felt more like indifference. Danielle could sense that something was terribly wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to confront her mother directly. Not yet. One afternoon, after Aaron had gone to work and Patrice was out, Danielle decided to search the house for anything that might explain her mother's odd behavior. She felt guilty for snooping around, but her gut told her there was more to this than met the eye. She went through drawers, cupboards, and Patrice's personal belongings. There was nothing unusual until she found her mother's phone, tucked away at the bottom of a drawer in the bedroom. Danielle hesitated for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew it was wrong to invade her mother's privacy, but something in her gut pushed her forward. With trembling hands, she unlocked the phone and started scrolling through the messages. Her breath caught when she saw the thread of texts between Patrice and Isaiah. At first, the messages seemed innocent enough, short exchanges about errands, updates on family events. But the further Danielle scrolled, the more intimate the messages became. Words like "miss you" and "can't wait to see you again" popped up, and Danielle's hands began to shake as she realized the horrifying truth. Her mother and Isaiah had been having an affair. The texts told the story Danielle had feared but refused to believe, meeting in secret, stolen moments, and confessions of love that Isaiah had hidden from her. As she read through the messages, her heart sank lower with each line. The betrayal was devastating. Isaiah, the man she loved, had been with her mother behind her back, and Patrice, the woman she had always trusted, had lied to her in the worst possible way. The last message in the thread was dated the night Isaiah disappeared. It was from Patrice, asking Isaiah to meet her at their usual spot outside of town. The words felt like a punch to the gut, and Danielle's mind spun. Was that the last time anyone saw Isaiah alive? The shock was overwhelming, but as the initial wave of disbelief passed, anger took over. Danielle had to know more. She grabbed the car keys and sped toward the cabin outside of town, where the message had said they met. The cabin was an old, run-down place that no one visited anymore, a perfect spot for secrets. When Danielle arrived, the place looked deserted, just as she had expected. But something about it felt wrong. She parked the car and approached the cabin, her heart racing in her chest. The front door was slightly ajar, and a cold shiver ran down her spine as she stepped inside. The air was thick and musty, and dust coated the floor, but there was something else. A smell, faint but unmistakable, of decay. The kind of smell that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Danielle followed the scent, her feet dragging across the old wooden floorboards, and when she rounded the corner into the back room, she saw it. A dark stain, nearly invisible in the dim light, splattered across the floor. Blood. Her stomach turned as she realized what she was seeing. Isaiah had been here, and whatever had happened, it hadn't been good. With trembling hands, Danielle fumbled for her phone and dialed the police. The dispatcher's voice on the other end of the line was a distant echo as Danielle tried to explain what she had found. Within minutes, a team of detectives arrived, sealing off the cabin as a crime scene. The next hours passed in a blur as the police began their investigation, combing through the cabin for evidence. Danielle stood outside, her mind numb as she tried to process what she had just uncovered. All the while, her thoughts kept circling back to one undeniable fact. Her mother had something to do with this. Later that evening, Detective Johnson, the lead investigator on the case, sat down with Danielle. His expression was grim, and his questions cut straight to the heart of what Danielle had feared. "Danielle, when was the last time you saw Isaiah?" he asked. Danielle hesitated, her mind flashing back to the last moment she had seen Isaiah alive. It had been a few days before his disappearance, but nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. "It was last week. He seemed fine." The detective's brow furrowed. "And what about your mother? Has she mentioned anything about Isaiah recently?" Danielle's stomach churned. She hadn't told anyone about the messages yet, but now, with the police involved, she knew she couldn't keep it a secret. She told Detective Johnson everything, about finding the texts, about her suspicions, and about the dark stain in the cabin. With each word, the knot in her chest tightened. The detective listened carefully, his face betraying no emotion, but Danielle could tell he was taking her words seriously. When she finished, he nodded, thanking her for the information. "We'll look into this," he said, his voice steady. "You've done the right thing by coming forward." But as Danielle left the police station that night, her mind was anything but at ease. She knew the investigation would soon turn its focus on Patrice, and the thought of what that could mean for her family made her sick with fear. She couldn't shake the image of her mother's face, calm and composed, hiding the dark truth underneath. Over the next few days, the police began piecing together the events leading up to Isaiah's disappearance. They interviewed neighbors, searched through security footage, and examined phone records. Each new piece of evidence seemed to confirm Danielle's worst fears. The blood found in the cabin was confirmed to be Isaiah's, and a witness had reported seeing Patrice's car near the location on the night he went missing. Danielle's world was crumbling. The mother she had loved and trusted was now the prime suspect in the investigation, and the weight of that truth was crushing. Patrice, for her part, remained eerily calm even as the police began to close in on her. She denied everything, claiming she had nothing to do with Isaiah's disappearance, that the affair had been over long before he went missing, that it was all a terrible misunderstanding. But Danielle knew better. She had seen the messages. She had seen the blood. As the police gathered more evidence, it became clear that Isaiah's disappearance was not just a case of a missing person. This was something far more sinister, and it was only a matter of time before the full extent of the truth came to light. The investigation into Isaiah's disappearance had taken a grim turn. Days turned into weeks, and the more the detectives dug into the case, the more they uncovered the dark and tangled web of lies surrounding the Carter family. The affair between Patrice and Isaiah had shocked the town, but no one was prepared for what would come next. The search for Isaiah intensified. After finding blood at the cabin where Patrice and Isaiah had met in secret, the police realized they were no longer looking for a missing person. They were looking for a body. Detective Johnson had a sinking feeling that this case would end in tragedy, but it wasn't until the police received an anonymous tip that everything changed. The tip came early one morning. A quiet, breathless voice on the other end of the line, leading the police to a remote area just outside of town, deep in the woods. The caller claimed to have seen something they couldn't explain, but they were too afraid to reveal their identity. Still, the information was enough to warrant a search, and by midday the detectives had gathered a search team and headed out to the location. Danielle stayed home, her mind racing with anxiety. She had no idea the police were that close to uncovering the truth, but the tension in the house was unbearable. Patrice, though calm on the surface, seemed more on edge than ever. Her once confident demeanor had begun to crack, and Danielle noticed the way her mother's hands trembled when she thought no one was looking. It wasn't long before the call came in. Detective Johnson's voice was low, serious, as he spoke to Danielle on the phone. "We've found something, Danielle. You might want to come down here." The drive to the site felt like an eternity. Danielle's thoughts spun in a whirlwind of fear, guilt, and confusion. What would they find? Had her mother truly done something unspeakable? By the time she arrived, the woods were swarming with police cars and officers, their expressions grim as they combed through the thick underbrush. Detective Johnson met her at the edge of the crime scene, his face ashen. "We found him, Danielle," he said quietly. "It's Isaiah." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Danielle felt the world tilt beneath her feet as she struggled to comprehend what he was saying. They had found Isaiah, but he wasn't alive. As she followed the detective deeper into the woods, the reality of the situation settled in like a lead weight in her chest. Isaiah's body had been discovered in a shallow grave, partially covered by leaves and branches. His clothes were torn, and there were clear signs of a struggle. The sight of his lifeless form, battered and broken, was more than Danielle could bear. She turned away, choking back sobs as Detective Johnson gently guided her back to the car. "We'll need to do a full investigation," he said, his voice soft but firm. "But there's no doubt. It's him." The discovery of Isaiah's body sent shockwaves through the community. News spread quickly, and soon everyone in Albany was talking about the grisly murder that had shattered their quiet town. The media descended on the scene, reporters clamoring for details, while neighbors whispered rumors about the Carter family and their dark secrets. But for Danielle, none of it mattered. All she could think about was the boy she had loved, the boy her mother had betrayed, and now, it seemed, had murdered. The police wasted no time in gathering evidence from the scene. The shallow grave where Isaiah had been found was just the beginning. Bloodstains on the nearby trees and disturbed earth suggested that he hadn't gone down without a fight. Forensic experts combed through the area, looking for anything that could point to who had done this. It didn't take long for their suspicions to zero in on Patrice. Danielle's mind was in turmoil as the investigation unfolded. The texts she had found between her mother and Isaiah were damning enough, but the police had uncovered more. Security footage from a gas station near the woods, showing Patrice's car driving toward the area on the night of Isaiah's disappearance. It was circumstantial evidence, but it was enough to make her a prime suspect. And then, there was the testimony from a neighbor who had seen Patrice cleaning out her car late at night, just days after Isaiah vanished. The neighbor had thought it strange at the time. Why would Patrice be scrubbing her car at such an odd hour? But they hadn't thought much of it until the police came knocking, asking questions about the Carter family. It all added up to a chilling picture, one that Danielle couldn't ignore. Her mother had been with Isaiah that night, just as the texts suggested. But something had gone horribly wrong. Had they fought? Had Isaiah tried to end the affair, only for Patrice to lose control? Danielle's heart ached with the weight of the truth. She couldn't believe her mother was capable of murder, but the evidence was becoming impossible to deny. And Patrice, for all her attempts to maintain a calm exterior, was starting to unravel. The police brought Patrice in for questioning, and that's when everything began to fall apart. At first, Patrice denied everything. She claimed she hadn't seen Isaiah that night, that she had nothing to do with his disappearance. But under pressure, her story began to crack. The detectives laid out the evidence, the texts, the blood in the cabin, the security footage, and slowly, Patrice's defenses crumbled. "I didn't mean for it to happen," Patrice whispered, tears streaming down her face as she sat across from Detective Johnson in the interrogation room. "I loved him. I never wanted this." But the truth was out. Patrice admitted to meeting Isaiah at the cabin, just as the texts had suggested. She had planned to talk things through, to convince him to stay with her. But Isaiah had been firm. He wanted to end the affair and go back to Danielle. That's when things turned violent. According to Patrice, Isaiah had tried to leave, but in a moment of desperation, she had grabbed him, begging him to stay. They argued, voices rising, and in the heat of the moment, she had lashed out. She didn't remember picking up the object, a heavy piece of wood lying on the cabin floor, but the next thing she knew, Isaiah was on the ground, blood pouring from his head. "I didn't mean to kill him," Patrice sobbed, her hands shaking. "It was an accident. I swear it was an accident." But there was no going back now. The evidence was overwhelming, and Patrice's confession sealed her fate. She had tried to cover her tracks, dragging Isaiah's body into the woods and burying him, hoping no one would ever find out. But now, the truth was out. For Danielle, the discovery of Isaiah's body and her mother's confession was more than she could bear. The woman she had looked up to, the mother she had loved, had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Not only had Patrice had an affair with Isaiah, she had killed him in a fit of jealousy and desperation. As Patrice was led away in handcuffs, Danielle stood frozen, watching her mother disappear from sight. The world she had known was shattered, and nothing would ever be the same. The trial of Patrice Carter began 6 months after Isaiah's body was discovered. By then, the story of the affair and the murder had gripped the nation, splashed across every headline, and talked about on every news channel. Albany, Georgia, had never seen anything like it. A scandal so shocking, so devastating, that it seemed straight out of a crime novel. The courthouse was packed the morning Patrice's trial began. The media had set up camp outside, cameras flashing as Patrice was led inside in handcuffs, her face pale and drawn. Her once immaculate appearance had faded, replaced by the haggard look of someone who had been broken by the weight of their own actions. But still, she maintained her innocence, insisting that Isaiah's death had been a tragic accident, not murder. Danielle sat in the courtroom, her heart heavy with a mix of emotions she could barely untangle. She hadn't spoken to her mother since the arrest. How could she? The woman who had raised her, who had been her role model, had not only betrayed her by having an affair with Isaiah, but had taken his life. The thought of it was too painful to bear, and every time she tried to confront it, the reality felt too surreal. Aaron sat beside Danielle, stoic and silent. He had aged what seemed like 10 years since the night of Isaiah's disappearance, his once strong and commanding presence now dulled by the shame and grief that had engulfed his family. He had been blindsided by the truth, unable to believe that the woman he had shared his life with for over 2 decades could be capable of such a crime. And yet here they were, watching as Patrice was put on trial for murder. The prosecutor, a sharp and methodical woman named Cynthia Dawson, wasted no time laying out the case against Patrice. In her opening statement, she painted a picture of a woman consumed by jealousy and obsession, a woman who couldn't handle the thought of losing the young lover she had seduced behind her daughter's back. Patrice's affair with Isaiah had been the catalyst for everything that followed, and when Isaiah tried to end the relationship, Patrice had lashed out in a fit of rage. She was a woman scorned, the prosecutor said, her voice steady as she addressed the jury. And when Isaiah Parker rejected her, she couldn't bear it. In that moment, she chose to take his life rather than face the reality that their affair was over. The evidence was damning. The text messages between Patrice and Isaiah, the security footage showing Patrice's car near the woods, and most crucially, the bloodstains in the cabin where they had met all pointed to her guilt. And then there was the confession, Patrice's tearful admission that she had struck Isaiah in the heat of the moment, that she hadn't meant to kill him, but had panicked when she realized what she had done. The defense, led by a seasoned lawyer named Frank Wallace, tried to cast doubt on the prosecution's narrative. Wallace argued that Isaiah's death had been a tragic accident, not a premeditated murder. He claimed that Patrice had been overwhelmed by emotion, caught in a toxic relationship that had spiraled out of control. He painted her as a victim of her own poor decisions, not a cold-blooded killer. "Patrice Carter is not a murderer," Wallace told the jury. "She made a terrible mistake, but she did not set out that night with the intention of taking Isaiah Parker's life. This was a tragic accident, nothing more." But the jury remained unmoved. Over the course of the trial, they heard testimony from witnesses who described the tension between Isaiah and Patrice in the days leading up to his death. They listened as Danielle recounted the moment she had found the incriminating text messages on her mother's phone, and they watched the grainy security footage of Patrice's car driving toward the woods that fateful night. Danielle's testimony was one of the most painful moments of the trial. Sitting on the witness stand, she tried to keep her voice steady as she answered the prosecutor's questions. Every word felt like a betrayal of the mother she had once loved, but she knew the truth had to come out. She had to speak for Isaiah, for the boy who had been taken from her in such a cruel and senseless way. "Did you ever suspect that your mother was involved with Isaiah before you found the messages?" the prosecutor asked. Danielle swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. "No," she said quietly. "I had no idea. I never would have imagined anything like that." "And when you found the messages, what did you do?" I didn't want to believe it at first, but then I saw the date on the last message. She had asked him to meet her that night, the night he disappeared." The prosecutor nodded, her expression sympathetic but focused. "And what did you do after that?" "I went to the cabin, the place where they used to meet. And that's where I found the blood." Danielle's voice broke as the memory flooded back. "That's when I called the police." The courtroom was silent as Danielle finished her testimony. The weight of her words hung in the air, heavy with the pain and betrayal she had endured. She avoided looking at her mother, who sat a few feet away, her head bowed and her face expressionless. As the trial drew to a close, both sides presented their final arguments. The prosecutor urged the jury to see Patrice for what she was, a woman who had let her obsession with a younger man drive her to commit an unspeakable act. The defense, meanwhile, pleaded for leniency, asking the jury to consider the emotional turmoil that had led to Isaiah's death. But in the end, it was the evidence that spoke the loudest. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning with their verdict. When the foreman stood to deliver the decision, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Danielle held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest as she waited for the words that would determine her mother's fate. "Guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom, and Patrice let out a strangled sob as the weight of the verdict hit her. She was found guilty of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 25 years. It wasn't the harshest sentence, but it was enough to ensure that she would spend much of the rest of her life behind bars. For Danielle, the verdict was bittersweet. Justice had been served for Isaiah, but her family had been shattered beyond repair. Her mother, once the woman she had looked up to, was now a convicted murderer, and the life Danielle had known was gone forever. As the courtroom emptied and the media swarmed outside, Danielle stood alone, her mind swirling with the events of the past year. She had lost Isaiah, lost her mother, and lost the sense of security she had once taken for granted. But in the midst of her grief, she found a sliver of strength. She had survived the worst, and now she had to figure out how to move forward. Isaiah's death had left a hole in her heart that could never be filled, but she vowed to honor his memory by living her life with the integrity and kindness that had defined him. As she walked out of the courthouse, the sunlight warm on her face, Danielle knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, one marked by loss, but also by resilience. And somewhere, deep in her heart, she hoped that Isaiah had finally found peace.